And the Congressional Commission that reported out a few years ago says two things. First of all, the range of debate with respect to deaths during the first year after the electric grid goes down is between the people who think it is 90% killed or only 2/3. That's the range of disagreement among the experts. Why? What are the casualties? They're not from the electromagnetic pulses. They're from the societal breakdown, from the starvation, from the lack of medicines, from all of that.
We think that's in the correct range. We don't have experience with losing the infrastructure in a country with 300 million people, most of whom don't live in a way that provides for their own food and other needs. We can go back to an era when people did live like that, and that would be 10% would be 30 million people, and that's probably the range where we could survive as basically a rural economy.
We've known since 2004 that the Russians have given the North Koreans this capability. We've known since the 1990s that the Chinese have been developing this capability. And the capacity for a North Korean satellite to have an EMP weapon is a very real danger in real time today. So how are we going to solve these things? Because if we don't solve them, there is a genuine catastrophe that could happen that would be of horrendous consequence.
In 2004 and 2008, the EMP Commission, which some of the members of that will be here today, testified before those of us on the Armed Services Committee that the U.S. society and economy are so critically dependent upon the availability of electricity that a significant collapse of the grid, precipitated by a major natural or man-made event, EMP or otherwise, could result in catastrophic civilian casualties. Let me say that again. Could result in catastrophic civilian casualties. That conclusion is echoed by separate reports recently compiled by the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, and National Academy of Sciences, along with various other government agencies and independent researchers. We now have 11 governmental agencies' studies on the severe threat and vulnerabilities we face from EMP and GMD, all of which came to very similar conclusions.
Many people prepare for economic collapse, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and floods. But the vast majority of the population of the United States is unfamiliar with an EMP and its effects. And those that are aware of it don't know what to do to prepare. You might wonder why preparing for an EMP is different than preparing for those events. The difference lies in the scope and length of the events. For hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and floods, the effects are localized to a part of the country. The rest of the country, which is unaffected, and the federal government will still be able to provide assistance. As for the length of those effects, they might span days or maybe even weeks. In comparison, the scope of the effects of an EMP are national. That means that the entire country, as well as the federal government, will be unable to come to your aid. And when it comes to the length of the effects of an EMP, it ranges from many months to several years. EMP stands for electromagnetic pulse. It is defined as, quote, an intense burst of electromagnetic energy caused by an abrupt, rapid acceleration of charged particles, unquote. To better understand it, think of an explosion. In an explosion, there's a shock wave of pressure and extreme heat that travels outward. When that wave interacts with particles in our atmosphere, you get an EMP. In the case of an EMP, the source of the explosion can be one of two things, the sun or a nuclear bomb. The sun is constantly exploding and generating energy waves that travel out into space. Most of the time, those waves miss us completely. Sometimes a small one will hit us and knock out our lights or scramble our radios or TVs for a bit. But once in a while, there's a direct hit from a large one. In that case, the EMP it creates in our atmosphere can do great damage worldwide. The good news is that either way, because it's coming from so far away, we typically have advance warning ranging anywhere from several hours to a couple of days. The second possible cause of an EMP is a nuclear bomb. Most of us are familiar with the effects that a nuclear bomb has when it detonates in a city. It kills everyone in it, knocks down buildings, and burns cars. But if that same nuclear bomb is instead detonated hundreds of miles in the sky, you get a very different effect. First, because it's so high up, the EMP it generates will cover a much wider area of land. Rather than just a city, it will cover many states or even the whole United States. Second, because it's detonated so high, it will not burn or damage people, buildings, or much else for that matter. What it will do is damage anything that uses electricity or has electronic components such as computers, cell phones, cars, and airplanes. What's worse is that it will also knock out our electricity nationwide. Now let's take a closer look at an EMP caused by a nuclear weapon, because unlike the one from the sun, this type of EMP has multiple components and can therefore cause more damage. There are 3 components in a nuclear EMP, named E1, E2, and E3. The first one, E1, happens in a billionth of a second. You might think of it as the leading edge of the EMP wave. E1 will instantly damage all kinds of electronics, from computers to cell phones, TVs, radios, and even those in cars and trucks. It will also damage the protective systems of electronic equipment. This will happen across the entire area covered by the EMP simultaneously. The second component, E2, lasts about the same as a lightning bolt, and while it's not quite as strong, it's spread across the entire EMP area again simultaneously. Normally, this part of an EMP would not cause too much damage because many systems have protection against lightning strikes. But because the E1 component knocks those protections out, E2 can cause further damage. The last component, E3, lasts longer than the first 2 and travels along long lines of conduction. In other words, electric lines or anything made of metal that is long and can carry electricity. In our case, we have approximately 160,000 miles of large capacity electric lines across the country. E3 will cause electricity to travel across these lines, perhaps damaging them before finally reaching the substations, where it will damage the thousands of very large transformers. Now let's talk about the electrical grid. There are several important things to know about the electrical grid and EMP. There are 3 grids that provide all electricity to the nation: the East Grid, the Texas Grid, and the West Grid. They are all interdependent. When one grid goes down, it requires help from another grid to come back up, that is assuming it is not damaged. There are thousands of very large transformers used throughout the thousands of substations nationwide, and they each take anywhere from 12 to 18 months to build. The worst part is that they're not built here, they're built overseas. Now here's the critical fact to understand. All of our national infrastructure depends on the electrical grid. Our oil and gas industry, our communications, water, banking and finance, transportation, emergency services, and government services all are dependent on the electrical grid. So what does that mean to our daily lives? Let's take a closer look. Our telecommunications all depend on electronics, computers, and electricity. Television, radio, internet, computers, cell phones, landlines, ham radios, all modern electronics, chips, transistors, etc. will stop working. Without telecommunications, no one will be able to communicate, including first responders. Banking and finance depend on electronics, computers, and electricity. ATMs run on electricity. Bank branches use computers, so without electricity, they will shut down. Without banking, our economy will collapse and we will be unable to get our money out of the bank. Transportation depends on electronics, computers, and electricity. There are approximately 4,000 planes flying above the U.S. at any given time. That's about 500,000 people. About half of those planes have the ability to fly without electronics. For those, the pilots will have to immediately glide their planes and attempt to land anywhere they can. The other half will likely drop out of the sky. Most modern trains have electronics that control the flow of fuel for highest efficiency. Trains will come to a stop wherever they may be. Modern cars have dozens of electronic components and chips that regulate operations. Most cars will simply shut off and roll to a stop and will be unable to start again. We will be left stranded wherever we may be. Trucks will be affected the same way as cars. One thing to keep in mind is what trucks deliver. Everything. Food, fuel, water, and approximately 80% of all goods nationwide. The fuel and energy infrastructure depends on electronics, computers, and electricity. Refineries will not be able to process crude oil into gasoline, diesel, and other fuels. There are approximately 100 nuclear reactors in the U.S., 2 of which are in Texas. Nuclear reactors have emergency generators, but will they work after an EMP? Even if they do survive, they only have anywhere from 7 to 30 days of fuel left. What happens then? Nuclear meltdown. Gas stations depend on electronics, computers, and electricity. Gas pumps won't work without electricity. Even if your car does work after an EMP, gas stations will be closed and they cannot do business without electricity and computers. Food infrastructure depends on electronics, computers, and electricity. There are only 3 days worth of food on grocery store shelves. There will be no refrigeration due to lack of electricity, resulting in rapid food spoilage, and delivery trucks will not be able to replenish grocery store shortages. Most families have less than a week's worth of food at home, nor do they have the knowledge or skills to produce their own food. The government, such as FEMA, will be incapacitated, unable to communicate or transport help to those in need, which will be everyone. Water supply infrastructure depends on electronics, computers, and electricity. Water facilities require electricity to run pumps. Without electricity, water processing plants will shut down. Most towns use electric pumps to run water up to their gravity-drawn water towers. Once the water in those towers runs out, you will be out of water. People can only live approximately 3 days without water, yet most people do not know how to purify water to make it safe to drink. To make things worse, if this happens in the summer, most of the country will be without air conditioning. Emergency services depend on electronics, computers, and electricity. Police will be unable to receive 911 calls and will be unable to transport themselves to the communities to respond to the overwhelming number of emergencies that will occur. The fire department will be unable to receive 911 calls, will be unable to transport themselves to the fires that will be caused by the overloaded electrical transmission lines, blown transformers, and arson. EMS will be unable to receive 911 calls. They will also be unable to transport themselves to the overwhelming number of emergencies that will occur. All of these first responders will also have to decide if they will stay on duty or head home to help their own families. Prisons depend on electronics, computers, and electricity. They hold approximately 1 million prisoners. What will happen to them when there's no electricity, water, or food? Will they be released when the prison is no longer able to care for them, or will they be left to die? Hospitals depend on electronics, computers, and electricity. Backup generators will quickly run out of fuel. Without electricity, all those life-maintaining machines will stop working. Pharmacies depend on electronics, computers, and electricity. Diabetic medicine needs refrigeration. You and the pharmacies will be unable to communicate with your doctor, and pharmacies will be unable to dispense medicines. Nursing homes depend on electronics, computers, and electricity. Many elderly will not survive long without electricity and what it provides. Government depends on electronics, computers, and electricity. High-level government and military are already protected. Much of the military equipment is EMP protected. Air Force One is EMP protected. Our Navy fleet at sea will survive, but will not likely be of much help to us. Most people think that because it's not all over the news and the government is not prioritizing protection against EMP, it must not be true. But the U.S. has known about EMPs for over 50 years. In 1962, the U.S. military, in an operation named Starfish Prime, detonated a nuclear device at an altitude of 250 miles and almost 900 miles from Hawaii, causing an EMP. Starfish Prime caused an electromagnetic pulse, which was far larger than expected, so much larger that it drove much of the instrumentation off scale, causing great difficulty in getting accurate measurements. The Starfish Prime electromagnetic pulse also made those effects known to the public by causing electrical damage in Hawaii, about 900 miles away from the detonation point, knocking out about 300 street lights, setting off numerous burglar alarms, and damaging a telephone company microwave link. The EMP damage to the microwave link shut down telephone calls from Kauai to other Hawaiian islands. This was at a time before the widespread usage of electronic components like those today. The damage today would be catastrophic to our electronic-dependent society. So none of that infrastructure, services, or utilities will be available after an EMP. Some might last a couple of days, many will stop immediately. But what does that really mean to you? To know that, you have to place yourself in the middle of an EMP attack.